Geography is the oldest weapon. Long before navies had radar, before they had fire control computers or electronic warfare suites, or the entire edifice of modern sensor architecture, they understood that the shape of the water determined the shape of the fight. A narrow passage between two land masses compressed the tactical options of any vessel, transiting it down to the one that mattered. Go through or don't go through. Everything else, speed, course corrections, defensive posture, was subordinate to that primary choice. The passage asked its question before any adversary did. What the adversary could do, if they understood geography as a weapon, was make the passage narrower. The People's Republic of China had, between 2013 and 2016, constructed 7 artificial islands on submerged reefs and shoals in the Spratly Islands chain of the South China Sea, dredging millions of tons of sand and coral from the sea floor, building runways and port facilities and barracks and radar installations on structures that international law, the UNCLOS Tribunal ruling of 2016, and the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all said had no legal basis for the territorial claims China intended to build upon them. The construction program had proceeded regardless of the legal assessments. The islands existed. The runways existed. The radar installations existed. And between 2 of those islands, separated by approximately 11 nautical miles of South China Sea, existed a transit corridor that the United States Navy had been using for freedom of navigation operations since the island's construction, asserting precisely because the corridor was contested that it was international water through which the right of innocent passage applied and would be exercised. At 7:22 a.m., the guided missile patrol ship entered the northern approach to the inter-island corridor. The 2 artificial islands, one to the east-northeast, one to the west-southwest, were visible on the radar display as fixed land masses, their construction infrastructure clearly returning on the surface search scope, their positions immovable and known. The corridor between them ran roughly northwest to southeast, and the patrol ship's transit heading of 145 degrees placed it on a track through the center of the navigable water between the 2 reefs. The center of the corridor, at its narrowest, was approximately 5.8 nautical miles from each island's constructed shore edge. 5.8 nautical miles was open water by any standard of maritime navigation. What it was not at 7:22 a.m. was empty. Underscore, quote, _0, underscore, east and west simultaneously. The CCG cutter from the east, closing at 14 knots on a westbound heading that would place it in the corridor's eastern half within 12 minutes. The fishing vessel cluster from the west, moving at 4 to 6 knots on a northward track that would position them in the corridor's western half over the same 12-minute window. The patrol ship was entering a corridor that was being filled from both sides simultaneously. The captain was on the bridge. He had been there since 7 a.m., 22 minutes before the corridor contacts appeared, reviewing the intelligence summary for the transit. The summary had assessed the likelihood of a single-axis approach, either CCG from the east or Militia from the west, as high, and had assessed a coordinated dual-axis approach as possible, but resource-intensive. The dual-axis approach was resource-intensive, and it was what was happening. Quote 1, the captain said. Quote 2, 1,800 yards. for the CCG and 2,100 yards for the nearest fishing vessel. That was the opening geometry. The picture at 7:22 a.m. with the approaches just beginning. Those numbers would change as both sides continued their approach and as the patrol ship continued its transit into the corridor. The financial weight of what was assembling was specific. The CCG Type 54 cutter at approximately $180 million in replacement value represented the operational investment China was deploying. The fishing vessel cluster, 11 contacts now confirmed, all Maritime Militia, at an average $2 million each, represented another $22 million. Total adversary presence value, $202 million, deployed to compress a corridor that the patrol ship at approximately $50 million was transiting on the legal basis that the corridor was international water, regardless of what any Chinese administrative authority asserted about it. The geometry was designed to make that legal basis feel narrower than the law said it was. At 7:27 a.m., the corridor picture had resolved further. The fishing vessel cluster to the west had spread into a loose line formation, not a tight formation, not a military formation, but a distributed line of 11 vessels whose northward movement was positioning them across the western half of the corridor in a pattern that would, if maintained, create a de facto western wall of fishing vessels inside the corridor's navigable space. The CCG cutter from the east was now at 3.1 nautical miles, its westbound heading placing it on a track that would establish it as the eastern wall of the same corridor. The corridor between the militia line and the CCG cutter's projected position was narrowing as both elements moved toward the center. Quote, both CPAs dropping. The geometry was compressing on both sides simultaneously at different rates. The CCG faster because it was moving at 14 knots. The militia slower because it was moving at 4 to 6 knots, but both moving, both closing, both reducing the navigable space between them. Channel 16 activated at 7:29 a.m. The CCG cutter's bridge team. Warship entering the Nansha Islands restricted area. This is China Coast Guard. You are required to obtain authorization before entering Chinese administrative waters. Alter course and depart immediately. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. Enforcement action. The phrase was new in the CCG's South China Sea broadcast vocabulary, added to the transmission template following domestic legal changes in China's Coast Guard law that had given CCG commanders broader claimed authority to use physical force against vessels it considered in violation of Chinese maritime law. The phrase did not change the legal status of the water. The water was international, but the phrase was in the record now at 7:29 a.m. as evidence that China had warned the U.S. ship of consequences before whatever followed. Log it, the captain said. No response. The captain stood at the bridge window and assessed the corridor geometry with the attention of someone who had been thinking about this specific configuration since before 7 a.m. The dual-axis approach, CCG from the east, militia from the west, was designed to present the patrol ship with a narrowing corridor and the implicit choice of what to do when the corridor became narrow enough that proceeding felt like threading a needle. The needle was not yet at threading width, but it was getting there. The question the geometry asked was not whether the patrol ship could fit through the corridor. The corridor was still more than 3,000 yards wide between the CCG's projected position and the militia line's projected position. The question was whether the patrol ship would act as if the corridor were narrower than it was, whether the presence of the two closing elements would produce a speed reduction, a course change, any behavioral signal that could be documented as a U.S. warship responding to Chinese administrative control of the corridor. The patrol ship held course 145 degrees at 15 knots. At 7:33 a.m., the first friction arrived from the western militia element. The 11 fishing vessels that had been forming the western wall made a formation adjustment that the CIC's tracking system flagged immediately. 3 of the 11 vessels in the western cluster had altered their courses from northward to slightly northeastward, courses that, if maintained, would project them into the corridor's center line rather than its western edge. The 3 vessels were moving to close the central portion of the corridor rather than hold the western edge. The adjustment was subtle, course changes of 15 to 20 degrees from their previous northward headings, but the effect was to compress the navigable space in the corridor's center from the west. CPA, 3 lead militia contacts, narrowing. Lead militia contact, now CPA, 1,200 yards. 1,200 yards for the lead militia contact, now approaching the corridor center. The CCG from the east at 1,400 yards. The space between them, not geometric, but functional. The space the patrol ship could transit without approaching within 1,000 yards of either element simultaneously. The Seahawk launched at 7:35 a.m. The helicopter climbed to 500 feet and established an overhead position above the corridor, its FLAR sweeping both the CCG cutter and the militia cluster simultaneously. At 500 feet above the center of an 11 nautical mile corridor with 2 closing elements, the Seahawk's camera produced the same overhead documentation frame that had been used in the Scarborough and Paracel encounters. A wide view showing the full geometry of what was happening. The patrol ship on its transit track, the CCG cutter approaching from the east, the militia line approaching from the west, and the 3 nautical miles of South China Sea that separated the 2 elements at that specific moment. That image was transmitted to 7th Fleet Command at 7:36 a.m. At 7:38 a.m., the second friction arrived from the CCG itself. The CCG cutter, which had been on a straight westbound heading since first contact, made a course adjustment at 7:38 a.m., 8 degrees to the south. The adjustment was small, but its navigational effect was significant. The southward course change moved the cutter's projected CPA from 1,400 yards to 950 yards over the next 8 minutes. The cutter was adjusting its approach to achieve a tighter eastern wall in the corridor, closing the eastern margin, while the militia closed the western margin. CCG course adjusted 8 degrees south. CPA revised 950 yards in 8 minutes. 950 yards for the CCG. 1,200 yards for the lead militia contact. The combined corridor between them had narrowed to a functional width of approximately 2,150 yards. Still navigable, still comfortably wider than the patrol ship's beam, but half the width it had been when the contacts first appeared at 7:22 a.m. At 7:41 a.m., Channel 16 activated again. Same text, same claim, same instruction to depart. The same enforcement action language. The captain's response was the same. Log it. The CIWS entered passive thermal track mode at 7:42 a.m., barrel oriented toward the CCG cutter, the eastern element, which was the larger vessel and the one carrying the formal Chinese Administrative Authority claim. Not engaged. Tracking. The CCG cutter's own EW systems would detect the CIWS tracking emission and report it to the cutter's bridge team. The message the tracking sent was the same as always. We have the precision data on you that matters. CPA, CCG, 820 yards, 6 minutes. 820 yards for the CCG. The lead militia contact on the western side, 1,050 yards. The corridor between them, approximately 1,870 yards of navigable space. Still open, still wider than the patrol ship needed, still narrowing. The captain made his first active response at 7:43 a.m. Oil LRAD to bearing 115, medium intensity, CCG contact in the beam. The long-range acoustic device trained east and activated. A directed acoustic signal that reached the CCG cutter across 820 yards of South China Sea as a focused, high-intensity sound source that was audible to crew on the open deck of the cutter and unmistakable in its intent from the cutter's bridge. The LRAD at medium intensity at 820 yards said, "We know exactly where you are and we have more instruments than the ones we have shown you." The CCG cutter's speed changed at 7:44 a.m. Not a course change, a speed reduction from 14 knots to 11 knots. The deceleration over 30 seconds was clear on the CIC's speed tracking, underscore, quote, underscore, 1, 2, underscore. At 11 knots, the CCG cutter's approach rate to its 820-yard CPA extended. The 6-minute timeline became 9 minutes. 9 minutes during which the militia's western wall was still advancing at 4 to 6 knots toward the corridor center. Underscore, quote, underscore, 13, underscore, 900 yards on the western side, 820 yards on the eastern. The corridor between them, 1,720 yards. Still open, still narrowing. The human on the wheel was 22 years old and had been on this watch since 7 a.m. His course was 145 degrees. It had been 145 degrees since before the contacts appeared, and it would be 145 degrees when he handed off the watch at the standard rotation time and the specific calculation he had been performing continuously since 7:22 a.m. Not a conscious arithmetic calculation, but the constant unconscious reassessment that experienced helmsmen performed of how much space existed between the ship they were steering and the things that were on either side of it, had been telling him for 17 minutes that there was still space, not comfortable space. The distinction between those two things was significant. He held 145 degrees. The corridor was still open. At 7:46 a.m., 7th Fleet Command's encrypted circuit delivered a message that the communication officer passed to the captain without delay. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs had transmitted a formal diplomatic note through the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, stating that the patrol ship was operating in Chinese sovereign waters, that China demanded immediate cessation of the transit, and that China held the United States responsible for any incident that resulted from continued unauthorized transit of Chinese sovereign territory. A diplomatic note transmitted through official channels in real time during an active transit. The note was unprecedented in its timeline. The MFA had transmitted within 24 minutes of the patrol ship entering the corridor. Someone on the Chinese side had been watching since the transit began and had escalated to the diplomatic level while the physical geometry was still developing. The note created a formal record in the diplomatic channel that paralleled the radio record the CCG was creating on Channel 16. The captain read the summary. He said, "Acknowledge receipt. Forward to 5th Fleet for State Department response. Continue transit. CPA, CCG, 740 yards, 8 minutes. Lead Militia, 820 yards. The corridor, 1,560 yards between the closest elements of the two walls. The patrol ship needed approximately 100 yards of clearance on each side. The safety margin for a 30-meter hull, transiting a constrained passage at 15 knots. The functional navigable corridor was 1,560 yards, minus the patrol ship's safety margins, 1,360 yards of maneuvering space, less than the corridor had been at 7:22 a.m. More than enough to transit. At 7:49 a.m., the Seahawk repositioned from its overhead documentation orbit to a track that placed it 200 yards ahead of the CCG cutter's bow at 300 feet altitude. The helicopter's position directly in the CCG cutter's forward path at 300 feet was not a physical obstruction. The cutter could not be blocked by a helicopter, but the Seahawk at 300 feet ahead of the cutter's bow occupied the cutter's immediate forward visual and sensor field, its downwash disturbing the water surface in the cutter's approach path, its FLIR locked onto the cutter's foredeck. The message was the same one it sent in every encounter. We are here. We are watching you in detail, and we are one decision ahead of wherever you are about to go. At 7:51 a.m., the fire control illumination radar activated on the CCG cutter. The directional emission swept across the cutter's hull with the precision that fire control systems operated at. A measurement, not a weapon parameter, but a measurement taken at the resolution that preceded weapon parameters. Every previous gray zone encounter had used this signal at the moment when the physical geometry was approaching its critical threshold, because every previous gray zone encounter had confirmed that the signal produced a behavioral change in the illuminated vessel. CCG 3901 at 740 yards. The Militia western wall at 820 yards. The corridor at 1,560 yards between them. The CCG cutter speed changed again at 7:52 a.m., 11 knots to 8 knots, a further 3-knot reduction. The cutter's approach rate slowed a second time, and at 7:53 a.m., the CIC operator's voice was measured, factual, carrying the specific quality of someone reporting a change they had been watching for. CCG contact. Course adjustment. 6 degrees north. Contact is opening its approach angle. 6 degrees north. The CCG cutter's course had been 288 degrees. It was now 294 degrees. A 6-degree adjustment that moved the cutter's projected path from a closing approach to a track that would produce a CPA further from the patrol ship than the previous geometry had been developing toward. CPA CCG revised, now 890 yards. Opening at 7:54 a.m. The Militia western wall showed its own adjustment. 2 of the 3 lead contacts that had been moving east-northeastward toward the corridor center altered course back toward the north, abandoning the centerline approach and returning to the western edge, holding position they had left at 7:33 a.m. The 3rd lead contact continued briefly before also altering course at 7:55 a.m. Militia lead contacts, course changes, all 3 returning to western axis, CPA opening. Both walls were opening. The corridor that had narrowed to 1,560 yards between its closest elements was widening again as the CCG cutter backed off its eastern approach and the Militia contacts abandoned their centerline push. CCG CPA now 1,100 yards. Militia lead CPA 1,050 yards. The patrol ship passed through the corridor's narrowest point at 7:56 a.m., the moment at which the CCG and Militia geometry had been simultaneously closest, and from which both were now opening. The compass read 145 degrees. The speed read 15 knots. Both had read 145 degrees and 15 knots for 34 minutes. No one on the bridge spoke for 90 seconds after the CPA counters began their opening sequence. Not silence, born of tension. The specific silence of a crew that has been holding something for 34 minutes and is allowing themselves quietly and without ceremony to register that the holding was over. The bosun's mate, standing at the starboard bridge wing door, uncrossed his arms. He had not been aware that they were crossed until he uncrossed them. He kept looking out the window. The CCG cutter was visible at 1,100 yards on the starboard beam. White hull, Chinese Coast Guard markings, its bow now angled slightly away from the patrol ship's track. On the port side, the Militia line was at 1,050 yards, their fishing vessel profiles distinct in the morning light, their courses now clearly diverging southward. The corridor was open. The transit track continued southeast toward the corridor's southern exit. Resume standard patrol speed on exit. Seahawk, continue overhead until we clear the corridor's southern boundary. The captain paused for 1 second. Well done. 2 words. The standard language of a commanding officer acknowledging a crew. Not effusive, not dramatic. Sufficient. At 8:09 a.m., the patrol ship exited the inter-island corridor's southern boundary. The CCG cutter was at 3.1 nautical miles to the north-northeast, no longer on an approach track. The Militia contacts were at 2.4 nautical miles northwest, dispersing from their line formation back toward the individual fishing positions they had left before the operation began. The 2 artificial islands were visible on the radar, fixed, immovable, the constructed fact of Chinese presence in the Spratlys, receding astern as the patrol ship continued south into the open South China Sea. The helmsman was relieved at 8:15 a.m. at the standard watch rotation. He handed off the wheel. He walked aft. He stopped at the passageway intersection between the bridge ladder and the mess deck and stood there for 3 seconds, looking at nothing in particular, processing nothing in particular. Then he went to breakfast. The situation report reached 7th Fleet Command at 8:22 a.m. CCG Type 54 cutter and 11 Maritime Militia fishing vessels executed a coordinated dual-axis compression approach on the inter-island corridor Phono-P track. CCG from the east, Militia from the west, converging simultaneously. Minimum corridor width between opposing elements, 1,560 yards. LRAD activated at 7:43 a.m. Fire control illumination at 7:51 a.m. CCG decelerated twice and adjusted course 6 degrees north at 7:53 a.m. Militia lead contacts returned to western axis at 7:54 a.m. Transit completed through the corridor on assigned heading. No course deviations, no speed changes in response to approach geometry. 11 Maritime Militia contacts. 1 CCG Type 54 cutter. 1 MFA diplomatic note through embassy channels. 34 minutes from first contact appearance to southern corridor exit. 740 yards. Minimum achieved CPA to CCG cutter before course adjustment. 820 yards. Minimum achieved CPA to militia lead contact. 1,560 yards. Minimum corridor width between both elements simultaneously. 0 course deviations. 0 speed changes. Transit completed. The Spratly Islands corridor is 11 nautical miles of South China Sea between 2 constructed reefs that the law says are not territory, and that China administers as if the law is a suggestion. The corridor is open to lawful navigation. It will remain open to lawful navigation as long as ships enter it and exit it without altering their course for reasons that would validate the claim that the corridor requires Chinese permission to transit. 34 minutes of dual-axis compression produced a corridor 1,560 yards wide at its narrowest. 1,560 yards was enough. The ship went through it. That was sufficient.